minds fly free, beyond his control.
So Borderlands 4 is finally here, and performance has been one of the biggest talking points even before the launch. We had Gearbox own CEO Randy Pitchford chiming in on Twitter saying their QA teams hit 60 FPS on minimum spec systems at medium settings, only for the official optimization blog to later confirm that minimum specs actually just target 30 FPS at 1080p, with recommended aiming for 60 FPS at 1440p. Already some conflicting expectations right out of the gate. But now that the game is in players' hands, things are looking pretty rough. Pretty much every GPU struggles to maintain smooth frame rates without relying on upscaling. And honestly, frame generation feels almost mandatory if you're aiming for anything above 60 FPS. That's honestly surprising, especially since Borderlands 4 doesn't push visuals that far beyond its predecessor to justify such a massive performance gap. And just as we suspected, the performance is just utterly bad, with all the usual Unreal Engine 5 culprit settings making a return. So in this guide I'll break down exactly which options matter most, how to balance visuals and performance, and what you need to do to get the smoothest experience possible in Borderlands 4. So on September 13th, Gearbox dropped a big blog update to calm the waters. They published optimized settings for most NVIDIA and AMD GPUs across Full HD, 1440p and 4K. By the way, since the charts you're about to see are pretty small and hard to read in video format, I'll leave a link in the description so you can look up your exact GPU and see the detailed settings for yourself. On paper, that sounds great, but once you look closely at the actual recommendations, a lot of it just doesn't make any sense. Take the Radeon 6800 XT for example. At 1440p, Gearbox suggests using high texture quality, but right next to it, the 6950 XT is set to very high. Both cards have the exact same amount of speed of VRAM. While technically the 6950 XT has a little more bandwidth thanks to faster memory chips, but in real world scenarios that difference is marginal at best. So why would one card suddenly deserve higher textures over the other? And it gets even worse. Look at the 6700 XT versus the 7700 XT. The 7700 XT is about 30% faster, yet the recommended settings are actually worse. How does that make any sense? This just feels random and effortless, like no one really tested these configurations properly. Oh, and don't think Nvidia cards are treated any better. They're actually recommending that RTX 3080 users run anisotropic filtering at just 4x. Meanwhile, on AMD's chart, it's either 16x or completely off. Why even bother adjusting anisotropic filtering like that? It's basically a free setting on modern GPUs. And the cherry on top, the RTX 5090 is the only GPU where they suggest running DLSS on quality. That alone says a lot about where performance really stands. So rather than just trusting these questionable recommendations, I'll be putting them to the test myself. I'll compare Gearbox's so-called optimized setting against my own tuned configuration using a 6900 XT. That card isn't listed on their chart, but since the 6950 XT is only about 2% faster on average, it's the perfect stand-in. Alright, let's start out with the graphics presets to see what we're actually working with as a baseline. Using the low preset, we're averaging around 55 FPS. From here, every step up in quality comes at a steep cost. Keep in mind that I only used FSR as an anti-aliasing solution in these comparisons. Going from low to medium drops us down to 44 FPS. That's about a 20% performance hit. Stepping up to high cuts us further to 36 FPS, a 35% drop compared to low. With very high, we're down at 28 FPS. That's almost a 50% loss in performance. And finally, the badass preset takes it all the way down to 24 FPS, a staggering 56% drop from low. On top of that, VRAM usage skyrockets. At low, the game only eats around 7GB of VRAM, but at badass, you're looking at well over 11GB. That's a huge jump, and it instantly explains why weaker cards or anything with less than 12GB of VRAM are going to struggle the moment you crank settings to high. So right out of the gate, these presets show us how punishing the game is when you push past medium. Next up, let's look at the upscaling techniques. Unfortunately, I can't test DLSS myself since I'm running on an AMD card, but as we all know, DLSS 4 currently delivers the best image quality out of all the options. So if you're on an NVIDIA GPU, that's the one I'd recommend using without hesitation. For everyone else, here's how things look. FSR 3.1 sadly comes in last place here. The image quality just isn't great, and shimmering is a well-known issue, also in Borderlands 4. If you're not happy with how FSR looks, your best bet is to switch over to TSR or even XeSS. Both give noticeably cleaner results, especially if you're not using frame generation or can't take advantage of DLSS. And one important side note, if you're on AMD's new RDNA 4 cards, the RX 9000 series, you can actually toggle FSR4 directly through the driver. That's definitely worth enabling since it gives you a much better balance between sharpness and stability than the in-game FSR 3.1 implementation. Now let's talk about frame generation, which is always a bit of a controversial topic. In Borderlands 4 though, I can confirm it actually works extremely well, as long as the requirements are met. That means your baseline frame rate should be at least 60 FPS on average. Anything below that and frame gen just isn't worth using. The whole point of this guide is to raise your baseline performance enough so you can enable frame generation and actually benefit from it. And if you're on an AMD card, there are a few optional driver settings that can make the experience even better. In the gaming tab, turn on Radeon anti-lag. With a good baseline frame rate, input latency is already very low, but anti-lag can tighten it up even further. Next, use the driver level sharpening filter at around 30%. This helps counteract some of the softness you get from FSR. And finally, set an FPS cap to stabilize frame generation for smoother frame pacing. A lot of people underestimate how important this is. I always recommend using the in-game FPS cap first before going to the driver level, since in-game caps usually handle timing and pacing more efficiently. With these tweaks, you can make frame generation feel far more consistent and responsive, instead of something that just inflates FPS numbers. Starting off with the HLOD loading range setting. It stands for hierarchical level of detail, and basically it controls how detailed certain objects appear at different distances. In practice, that means things like foliage or small environmental details load in at higher quality the further out you set this option. Now, in terms of performance, there's pretty much no difference between the presets. Whether you're on low, medium or high, the frame rate stays almost identical. The only real impact here is on VRAM usage, which steadily increases the higher you set it. In this scene, you can actually see the effect quite clearly. On low, the leaves on these bushes pop in with very basic detail, but starting at medium, they gain much sharper definition and hold that quality from a longer distance. Next up, let's take a look at geometry quality. In Unreal Engine 5, this setting controls the level of detail for 3D models, basically how complex or simplified objects become as you move closer or farther away. Performance-wise, there's little to no impact here, at least not in the most obvious scenarios. But visually, the difference is a lot easier to spot. For example, as we walk toward this large tree, you'll notice leaves and branches popping in once we reach a certain distance. On lower settings, the transition is harsher, while higher settings keep the detail intact from farther away. It also influences subtle things like wind animation on trees and bushes. Those differences aren't nearly as noticeable during normal gameplay, but they're there if you look closely. Interestingly, in my testing, the medium setting actually showed the least pop-in, even less than high. Because of that, I'd personally recommend sticking with medium here. You get the best balance of visuals and stability without sacrificing any performance. Next is texture quality. In Borderlands 4, this doesn't change the resolution of textures. They're the same across all settings. What it does is control how much is loaded into VRAM at once. Lower settings mean more texture pop-in. Higher settings mean smoother loading. Performance isn't really affected unless you run into a VRAM bottleneck, which can cause stutters. So if you're VRAM limited, stick to low. Otherwise, go with high or very high. Texture streaming speed is most noticeable when swapping weapons or climbing walls. Between all three presets, high actually finished loading textures the fastest in my testing. VRAM usage didn't really change at first glance, so performance stays the same. In Borderlands 4, anisotropic filtering isn't completely free. I measured about a 6% drop going from off to 16x, which makes sense since textures work a bit differently here. Visually though, there's barely any improvement past 4x. So I'd say stick with at least 4x for clarity and only go all the way to 16x if you're not bandwidth limited and want the absolute best. AF is often underestimated in Borderlands 4, especially once frame generation is on. With the baseline frame rates already being on the lower side, every percentage of performance really counts. And fighting for those extra gains here can make a noticeable difference in overall smoothness. In my case, running the GPU at 8x instead of 16x actually performed worse, since shaders need to fully load in, so bandwidth can matter here as well. So as a first, I would actually recommend putting anisotropic filtering to 4x as a hidden performance boost. Next up we have foliage quality, and this is one of those settings that really transforms the look and feel of the game. As the name implies, it controls the density of foliage like grass and bushes across the open world. With the setting on off, pretty much everything is gone. The bare texture underneath looks awful and it completely kills immersion, so I wouldn't recommend using this at all. On very low, you'll start seeing some patches of grass, but it's still way too sparse to look good. Low gets closer, but in my opinion it's still not enough to make the world feel alive. Medium is where things really come together. It introduces grass in the distance and adds enough density that the environment finally feels natural without going overboard. On high and very high, the world looks even fuller, with very high filling almost every single free patch of ground. It looks great, but the difference from medium is more about subtle density rather than a massive leap. Performance-wise, the impact is not too bad overall, but in foliage-heavy environments, the hit can get more noticeable. That's why I recommend sticking with medium as a safe choice. If you find you still have performance to spare, then going all the way to very high is an easy upgrade for extra visual fidelity. Next we've got Volumetric Fog. In Unreal Engine 5, this setting controls how light interacts with fog and particles in the air, creating shafts of light, depth, and atmosphere in the world. Visually, the improvements really start to show from medium upwards. High already looks great and adds strong depth, while very high takes it a step further, but at a steep cost of about 16% performance hit. I'll excuse my example here since the sun was moving during the test, so the comparison isn't perfect, but trust me, in most scenes the higher settings do look noticeably better. For the best balance of visuals and performance, I'd recommend sticking with high. Moving on to volumetric clouds. This controls how clouds form, move, dissolve, and evolve in the sky, adding depth and realism. One thing to note is cloud shimmering during these movements. It's least noticeable on very high, but the improvement over high is minor. Since going from high to very high costs about 3 to 4% performance, I'd recommend sticking with high. Visually it's very close, but you save a bit of performance. Shadow quality controls the shadow casts for most light sources in the world, while the sun itself is handled separately by directional shadow quality. As you raise the setting, shadow edges get softer and more natural looking, which adds realism. Performance-wise, going from low to high or very high means about a 6% drop, from 48 FPS down to 45. Since high and very high look nearly identical, I'd recommend using high as the safe choice. Very high can cost more performance in certain scenarios without giving you a noticeable visual benefit. As we just mentioned, directional shadow quality affects all shadows cast by the sun, meaning every shadow you see outdoors during the day cycle. Just like with regular shadow quality, raising the setting mainly softens the edges for a more natural look. I'd recommend going with high here as well. It strikes a good balance between visuals and performance without the extra cost of very high. Volumetric cloud shadows, as the name suggests, affects the shadows cast by clouds. In theory, this should add realism, but I think this one comes down to personal preference. For me, turning it off actually looks better. The brighter image just fits the cel-shaded style of the game more naturally. And as a bonus, you also save a bit of performance. Borderlands 4 naturally uses Lumen Lighting since it's built into Unreal Engine 5. And just like I mentioned in my optimization guide for abiotic factor, this is one of the heavier settings because it also includes global illumination. Visually, the light bounces become more noticeable once you hit high, but that's also where performance really starts to tank. From low to high, you're looking at about a 15% drop in performance, and going all the way up to very high means a massive 30% hit. Next up is reflections quality. This setting is also part of the Lumen system, which makes it a heavy option starting at medium. On low, reflections are almost non-existent, but compared to the very noisy and shimmering reflections on very high, I would still stick with low. Borderlands 4 rarely has reflections anyway. The only thing you'd miss are water reflections, which are absolutely not worth the performance hit. Performance drop from low to very high is around 15%. Next up is shading quality. This setting affects how detailed and complex the shaders in the game look, adding depth and nuances to surfaces. Think of things like richer materials, subtle lighting variations, and complex textures. For example, check out this huge table in the scene. Interestingly, in my testing, medium actually performed the best, which is why I recommend sticking with medium. The visual difference while playing is barely noticeable. Like many other settings, without a direct side-by-side, it's hard to spot. It didn't increase VRAM usage, so the performance hit is purely based on rendering. In the side-by-side comparison, check out the chairs. The red tone changes completely between medium and high. If you really have the performance to spare and these shader details matter to you, high is an option, but for most players, medium hits the sweet spot. Lastly, we have post-processing. This setting controls effects like bloom, various filters, and depth of field. For example, how weapons and objects react to light and focus in the scene. The bloom effect is quite noticeable here with the sun glaring through the clouds. On low, weapons look dull compared to higher settings. They shine more and react better to lighting at medium and high. The most noticeable difference, however, is the depth of field on the back of the weapon view, which I really like. It adds a subtle but immersive touch. Here, I recommend using high for post-processing, as it provides the best visual impact without any performance penalty. Only very high causes a small 4% performance drop and offers almost no visual improvement over high. So, just as promised, here are the side-by-side comparisons showing max settings, Gearbox's own optimized settings, and of course my personal recommendation. For fairness, upscaling was set to quality across all three. And that wraps it up. These are my optimized settings for Borderlands 4. If you found this helpful, don't forget to drop a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next optimization guide. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.